Good morning from London. On behalf of the Goethe Institute London and everyone involved, I'm very excited to welcome you all from around the world to the DAO sessions Artworld Prototypes. This is already the second online event to discover a new set of experimental projects to reinvent the future of the art world with blockchain by investigating what can be learned from DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, working with others. Each event introduces one of 5 new progressive blockchain art prototypes created by DAO teams in Berlin, Hong Kong, Johannesburg, and Minsk, as part of a large international collaboration of the last 18 months. Each session aims to address a key question about the potential of blockchain systems to decentralize power structures and to rewire the arts. I briefly want to use this moment to thank everyone involved who has been working tirelessly in the different cities during these exciting endeavors. In order to include the widest audience possible, we are very pleased to welcome Kat here with us today, who will be translating today's event into British Sign Language. And we will be using visual descriptions, which means any presenter will describe themselves shortly and any images they use. So I'm Katrine and I have dark hair and I am lockdown pale, wearing a black dress and a scarf today. And we have Kat here with us who has blonde hair and has a green top. Welcome, Kat. Please do post any questions you have in the Q&A section and our hosts will ensure that they get heard and discussed by our presenters. If you do not want to use your name in relation to a question you post in the Q&A section, please do state so when asking the question. I will now hand over to Ruth Catlow, Artistic Director of Furtherfield, and Penny Rafferty, who are curators and hosts of the DAO sessions Artworld Prototypes. Thank you to you both.
Thanks, Catherine. We're really excited to be here now for the second session. I'm Ruth Catlow. I'm a white woman with medium length brown hair, glasses, and a kind of greeny golden top that I picked out to go with our green coloured wallpaper. We all have the same kind of covalence celebrating wallpaper today. We're here today to meet and hear about the Covalent Studio DAO prototype by the team, which is made up of Bhavisha Panchia, Kylie Whittaker, Chad Cordeiro is also involved, although he isn't here with us today. And they are based in collaboration with our partners at Tomorrow Gallery in Johannesburg. Bhavisha Panchia is a curator and researcher of visual and audio culture, currently based in Johannesburg. And Kylie Whittaker is an independent artist, curator, researcher, and lecturer, also based in Johannesburg. Of course, this is our Johannesburg team. So we're going to start today, as we always will, for all of these 6 sessions, with a very short explainer about DAOs and what we think they bring to the art world. Then we'll talk a little bit about kind of what our aims are for the project. And then we'll have the presentation from the Covalence guys, interspersed with questions from you all, audience members, and us. We'll probably save questions. Like last week, we had really useful, clear questions that would have supplied us with about 3 hours of conversation. So what we'll do at very least is try and read out the questions that are coming up. During the presentation, we will only ask questions of clarification, but we'll save the kind of meaty discursive stuff until the end. So why DAOs, why the art world? So what DAOs? Let's start with that. So DAOs are automated organizations. So this is a new way of working to pool and distribute resources collectively, and they benefit from the trust and verification systems, blockchain-based funding, member anonymity, transparent governance, and translocal partnerships. So these are the kind of sets of things that we think make them interesting for the kinds of artists that see organisation as part of a kind of practice. Last week, we invited people to consider Artworld DAOs as executable manifestos, so a kind of revamping of the artist manifestos of Dada, Situationism, etc. So a permanent record of Artworld community interactions, a powerful vehicle for mobilising future works of collective imagination. This week, I think in kind of, as part of the kind of covalence context, I think we can think of Artworld DAOs as co-owned organisations that, rather than the usual mystique and opacity of Artworld operations, make much more explicit and visible the value flows between networks of all of its community members. We can think of them as maybe programmable cooperatives in which the share of financial, material and cultural capital are automated based on the interests carefully considered in advance by all of its members. Okay, Penny.
Thank you, Ruth. So I'm Penny Rafferty. I'm working alongside Ruth with this series. I'm a white woman with very short hair, green eyes, freckles, and wearing a black polo neck and black cap. I just want to speak a little bit to the kind of aims of these presentations, which initially was hacked out in a long lunch quite some time ago with the beautiful Athenian sun between myself and Ruth, based on a lot of previous groundwork that has been done not only from ourselves, but also from a number of peers who we've been constantly in exchange with over the course of the development of this project. And so, in a sense, these presentations is to share and exchange knowledge about the genesis, process, and results of 2020 Artworld DAO prototype development. And we started this project because we kind of knew it was important for us to begin to think in radically different ways about our near future. In one of our early conversations, it became extremely apparent that that meant also connecting with people outside of our EU sprawl. This has allowed us to gain valuable and insightful conversations, discussion, and knowledge about how to tackle this together. So in a sense, there has been many ways in which we've spoken about translocality versus universality. And this has allowed us to unpack how blockchains enable new forms of cooperation in and across localities, and how different localities can bring new value, alternative modes of governance, and imaginative communities. This is crucial in thinking about local context and local need first, and then working a forkable blueprint from there on in. And in a sense, how collaborative artistic practices and networks can bring necessary breadth to diversify human creation and open up methods of working and thinking differently together across the globe. And lastly, how to see technology as mutable and intuitive, allowing the technology to mold around the user's needs instead of adapting the body to the tech. The world we live in is small, even with its infinite reach through the proxy of technology, yet the arts have an uncanny way of allowing that world to become graspable, which is why we need to be part of this conversation about our future society. And when I say we, I mean as many as possible, because the world should be both micro and macro. This is also one of the fundamental ideas and drives of creating the Artworld prototype series and binding it to the blockchain before DAO technologies have become gentrified and we live in one vast, scaled up world that works for no one. And I think that part and parcel of working with these 5 different groups has really allowed us to expand beyond any way in which purely our peers could do. It's really this kind of huge boiling pot of conversation, arguments, alignments, and negotiation that, in a sense, will never come to a close, I hope. And so without any more delay, I would like to hand it over to Covalent Studios.
And just a reminder, because I always forget, if we could start with, could you describe yourselves, please, before you start your presentation?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Bhavisha. I'm a short Indian South African woman. I have short dark brown hair, dark brown eyes, currently wearing quite thick black rimmed glasses, and a t-shirt that I made that reads Busy but Broke, which is a kind of curatorial uniform for myself.
Hi, I'm Kylie Whittaker. I'm a white female, also quite short, although you can't really tell from Zoom. I have long dark brown hair and dark eyes as well.
Cool. And then we'll begin. I'm going to start by giving some kind of background context into the development and ideas around Covalent Studios for the first kind of 10 minutes or so, and then Carly will go into looking at the methodology and processes that we've undertaken over the last couple of months and trying to engage with communities here in Johannesburg. Okay. So I'll start by describing the studio in terms of three kind of descriptors so that everyone can get a better idea in terms of what the kind of objectives and scope is. So Covalent Studios is a community-based platform that facilitates exchanges and collaboration amongst creative practitioners. The studio's objective is to support interdisciplinary, experimental, and participatory-based works and projects. It's a space for artists to test their toolkits, art in different terrains. And thirdly, Covalent Studios is a proposition to work across existing networks to support more lateral connections and sustain our creative practice. And the kind of development around Covalence as a digital online space is born around the shared audio studio space as a model from which to think about collaboration and exchange. So the shared artist studio is a space for individual and collective thought and expression. It is a space for exchange and collaboration, often framed within the social and the participatory. It is also a liberatory space to reflect, critique, and innovate with others. Covalent Studios is an attempt to bridge the ideology of the shared studio space with the fundamentals of DAOs that support self-governance, agency, and transparency. So Covalent Studios turns to the ideology of blockchain as a base from which to create a shared, equitable space for the production of art, but also to incentivize collaboration and experimentation. The image you're currently looking at is an installation view of a studio model that we've been looking at, which is DGI Studios. The third collaborator with me and Kylie is Chad Cordeiro, and he is one of the co-founders of this printmaking studio, which is collaborative in its functioning within the city of Johannesburg. All right. Just to give you some context into the city of Johannesburg and the kind of how Covalence responds to the kind of current context, in that, like many global cosmopolitan cities, Johannesburg is the home to a number of, I'd say, global international artists. Though over the last couple of years, what we've seen is a kind of decline in trust, or mistrust rather, with the public sector in terms of funding and sustainability for the arts and humanities in general. And so what has happened is that there has been an increase in privately funded public organizations kind of picking up the slack where the public sector has been failing. And, you know, if we talk about the Department of Arts and Culture in South Africa, doesn't have the greatest reputation, a lot of mistrust from us as practitioners in terms of the mismanagement of funding and just general corruption. And so this is the kind of context in which we're operating, and also then having to rely on the commercial gallery sector in terms of cultivating, sustaining artistic practice here. And that in itself has also contributed to a particular type of work that gets produced. And I feel as if though it has limited the kind of scope for, again, more experimental practice that may not fit into the kind of aesthetics and politics that commercial galleries are pushing into the international market. And then, of course, we have COVID that has wonderfully contributed to
complexifying.
Yeah, the existing situation that we all find ourselves in, and also drawing out the kind of the relationship between the global north and the south. I mean, a lot of work for artists here has also been cancelled. Like, we're so entangled in terms of the dynamic between these two, let's say, spaces. Yeah. That said, you know, art does prevail, and artists have kind of worked against these kind of conditions and contexts, and have created collectives, collaborative studios, publishing initiatives, and online residencies such as Floating Reverie, which Kylie has initiated. Given all of these, let's say the ecology is rather small and competitive, and what you then have are these cliques of insular networks that don't necessarily speak to each other. And what Covalence attempts to do is to kind of bridge those networks so that we can find a more kind of holistic way of working. I also just want to mention a couple of initiatives that exist and have existed. They include Sober and Lonely, Floating Reverie, which is online residency Kylie has initiated, Assemblage Studios, DDI Studios, Kilaketla Library, Flat International Gallery, which was operational in the mid-90s, Nothing Gets Organized, and Black Mark. And all of these kind of like subset initiatives have really contributed to the shaping, let's say, of networks and the kind of intellectual kind of
ecosystem.
Yeah, ecosystem. We thought, thanks, Kylie. Yeah, so in that sense, sorry, I'm just going to. Oh yes, so I want to bring your attention to Atlantic House. This is another installation shot of a studio space in Cape Town, which is a shared studio space that also functions as an exhibition space, a site for discursive activities. And this site came up as I was in conversation with another practitioner called Josh Ginsberg, who's the director of the A4 Arts Foundation in Cape Town. And we were talking about the studio specifically, and the kind of chance encounters that happen between artists as they kind of are in their own spaces. And this is a kind of another model that's been inspired towards thinking of Covalence. And lastly is the Bag Factory Artist Studios, which is also part of the Triangle Arts Network Alliance. And the studio has been in place since the early 90s, and it's really become a site. It's a shared group studio. I'm not sure how many studios there are there, but it's also a space where international artists are invited to participate. And it really has created a very interesting network amongst the artists who share the space. So it really has cultivated quite an interesting like bond between artists.
It's also, been quite like foundational in the development of many artists' careers and enabled them to have sustainable careers in the way in which they work either individually or collaboratively, and encourages a lot of young artists to grow from this as a starting point, which I think is quite unique.
Yeah, definitely. And so Covalent Studios is, has been developed in conversation with these existing physical spaces, again, to cultivate collaboration and incentivize collaboration amongst these kind of disparate networks. On one level, it is a space for like the exchange of physical material resources, but it's also envisioned as a space in which it holds kind of creative and intellectual support for artists. Yeah. Again, yeah, so it's, oh, sorry. No, it's fine. So this is, I'm going to end up with like kind of two anecdotes that I've come across just by chance. And this was a t-shirt. This is a quote found in a t-shirt that I acquired that a good friend and colleague artist, Tony Kirks, produced. And it reads, if you want to evolve something, first you need a space so people can get together and exchange whatsoever they're going to exchange. And so I've had this t-shirt, which I should have probably worn, but I've been walking around with this quote and it really just started to resonate as we were thinking about covalence. I think fundamentally it's about creating space for communities that don't exist yet. And then secondly, I've also been following the work of Matt Dryhurst and Holly Herndon's Interdependence. And he had posted this tweet on Twitter and it kind of just brought together, I mean, he's talking about the music industry specifically. And so he was, proposing a project, and I was thinking about this project in relation to creating artistic projects. And should I read it? I'll read it out. Matt Dryhurst, January 3rd, idea that I don't have time to do. One album a year, funded and created by a DAO of contributors, daily comms run in Discord. Mod serve as producer, organizing work and stewarding overall vision. Everyone holds equity in the project, reflecting their contributions. It'll work. So there's an optimism there that these kind of organizational structures can create projects in a more equitable, transparent way, which is, again, something that Covalence is hoping to be able to do and also espouse in terms of a kind of culture of sharing and exchange, which I think is a challenge, will be challenging, but yes. Then I'll pass over to Kylie, who's going to take us through the model and structure of how we're envisioning the different elements and functions of the studio.
So here's a diagram which we developed over a series of workshops, which I will break down shortly. That shows the structure of the workshop. So in the top left, you can see quite a big circle that has various practitioners and skills listed in the bubble, such as artist, programmer, producer, legal, video editor, accountant, tax. So all the skills that you may need as an artist or as a creative practitioner, and this is what the studio would consist of. And through Covalence, these participants would be able to collaborate, contribute to patronage, and exchange various resources based on the projects that they were either invested in, wanted to execute, or wanted to contribute towards. And that would ultimately feed into a editorial platform. And this is where all the members could submit work for review based on certain criteria. And this is just the general structure that we've come up with, as I said. So when Bhavisha Chad and I first started chatting about Covalence, there were a lot of conversations that we were having around the structure, the organization, like what it would do, how it would do it. And we just found that it was quite insular, and we needed to expand and look beyond the scope of our needs and requirements. So we decided to use a sort of various participatory design methodologies, and look at how we could use artists that we'd either worked with in the past or creative practitioners we'd worked with in the past or knew who would be possibly interested in a system like this to help establish what the context was, what the needs were. This helped us to frame what the problem was and ideate around it in order to move forward with possible solutions. So we ran 2 participatory workshops, and then in between those, we conducted a survey. So for the first workshop, and on this slide, you can see a screenshot of the participants, which were a diverse representation of races and genders, consisting of white, politically black, cis, het, and queer participants. And it was crucial that that was the case. And for the first workshop, we wanted to establish what the needs and wants of a contemporary collaborative art space would and could be from these participants. We then spoke more specifically to membership, governance, and tokens. And then Chad, Bhavisha, and I had, prior to the workshop, developed different models that we thought, based on our discussions, that it would look like. And we presented these models. And as you can see here on the slide, there are 3 very different looking models, which ultimately combined to form the first model that I showed you earlier. And this was a really great exercise in terms of both us using our voices and our understanding of things and working with the participants in order to understand how they would envision this being. We then ran a survey with those participants and asked them to share with other practitioners in the field. And what this did was this gave us qualitative and quantitative information about the needs and the wants of the contemporary space. It was divided into 3 sections. So first, we sort of had an introductory section which focused on general practice, skills, and resources, and then studio structure and membership. And we structured this workshop based off of the survey based off of the first workshop, which really identified the fact that there was a lot of unseen labor and unvalued, not valued is the wrong word, but like unrewarded labor that as creative practitioners we were doing. And there were a lot of skills and work that we were doing that we didn't have, that we needed, and that this could definitely be a space for that to exist. We also identified that there were, as Bhavisha said earlier, these networks that were sort of practicing in silos and had the potential to overlap, but for various reasons such as legacy and politics and location, might not have ever had the opportunity to sort of expand or break away and form a bigger network. And so those were sort of our insights which fed into this survey. Here on the slide, you can see there are 2 pie charts which show some of the results from the questions. So the first chart, the question was, do you have more than one occupational profession? And there was 87.5% said yes, which sort of affirmed that we were sort of heading in the right direction, that people had multiple skills that could be shared across and be, you know, expand through a network like this. And then the second chart was based off of the question, would you describe your practice as collaborative? And that sounds like quite an obvious question, but I think it was important for us to know that the people would want to be practicing collaboratively in the studio.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
To have a clear understanding if we're going to build a system, if it's going to be actually useful to
people.
To the participants and the members.
Yeah.
So
and 75% of the respondents said yes. There were other answers like no. Someone said no. Someone said my curatorial practice, yes, but beyond that, less so. Someone said sometimes, depending on the project, and another person just said sometimes. So there was an overall resounding yes from the respondents. Here are another 2 graphs. The first is a pie chart that says, that asked the respondents, if given the opportunity, would you want to participate in Covalent Studios, where sharing resources and skills, exchange is determined and agreed upon by both parties? 75% said yes, and 25% said maybe. And I think that based on further discussions with the respondents, the maybe is based on like depending on how it would work and how that exchange would operate and what the sort of terms and conditions of that exchange would be. But most people tended towards a yes. In what shape or the next is a bar graph that's in relation to the question, in what shape or form would you be able to contribute as a Covalent Studio member? And the options were time, skills, resource, and money. And those are the sort of categories of exchange that we'd come up with. And skills was a resounding majority. People said that they could definitely contribute skills. Money was less so, which makes a lot of sense based on the arts scene. Time was also valuable, was also seen as something that people could contribute. And resources was the third most selected. Here we have some more qualitative answers that were in response to what kind of expectations would you have for other members in the studio. And I think the one answer I'm just going to focus on for time purposes is respect and fair exchange. Do what you say and say what you do. And I think that that feeds into the idea of trust and people wanting to trust this network, and that being very important to cultivate. And that was something that we picked up on even in workshop 1, is people wanting to stick in their network, stay in their network and rely solely on their network because of trust, because they've developed these relationships and they know that there's like a trusting working relationship amongst their community and amongst their network, and expanding that is something that might compromise the work that you do, the success of it, the value of it, and the ease of it. So I think that that's something that's really important for us to try and cultivate, to continue to cultivate in Covalence and enable people to cultivate through the system themselves. I'm going to move through this a little bit. Here is another qualitative answer to the question, what kind of expectations would you have for other members in the studio? And I think the answer I'm going to focus on here, which relates strongly to the previous answer, is transparency, activity, solidarity, and kinship. And again, people wanting that from a studio space, people wanting that from their network, in spite of practices. Then we decided to run another workshop, and this workshop was quite specific. What we decided to do was focus on specific scenarios that the studio in operation, that the studio would operate, how the studio would operate. Here you can see another screenshot of the participants. So we ran these participants through 4 scenarios, user flow diagrams, which I will show you shortly. The first scenario was how you would become a member and how you would request a resource exchange. Scenario 2 was how you would move into the studio space for a specific collaborative project. Scenario 3 was acquiring a token and how you would use them for exchange and in the annual general meeting. And then scenario 4 was the editorial platform and committee and how that would operate. So here is the scenario 1 diagram, and as you can see, it's a user flow diagram, and it shows key actions, decisions, sort of screens and key pieces of information. Here is a zoomed in version where you see user 1 passing through the sign up stage and then moving to be able to edit their profile page, move towards the skills exchange and searching for skills. And we did this, we plotted these diagrams out for each scenario and then got feedback from the participants on how we would change things. Again, speaking to specific things like tokens and value and trust and how that would be maintained in the system. So once workshop 2 sort of ended, we had a lot of, whilst there was some behavioral and scenarios that had been resolved, there was still a lot of questions that we were asking of the system itself. Here's another close-up of that scenario 1 diagram.
Yeah, and then I'll speak to the kind of what is kind of up in the air or unresolved. There's particularly, I think, the kind of token relationship between tokens and incentivizing within the studio, and how those, to what actions are those created and how they're circulating within the system. That's something we need to start thinking about. And then also just on a technical level, in terms of sustaining the actual DAO, in terms of labor and costs, and how we would be able to like get capital, create capital to sustain it, whether members need to like chip in, we're not sure. And then also how the kind of editorial platform, or kind of a space rather, where members could showcase their work, whether or not that would need some sort of, again, editorial guidance, who would be doing that, who'd be responsible for that, and yeah. So that in a 20 minutes nutshell is
24
is where we currently at, and yeah, I hope it allows for a kind of great understanding of the kind of intentions of the studio and what we hope it to become, and yeah, hopefully it will exist soon. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
Can I stop sharing, or?
Yeah, why not? Can I jump in with a question?
Sure.
Can I preempt your question by saying, please, audience members, now ask your questions. Don't hold back.
Before I use all the timer. Thank you so much for the presentation. I would just like to kind of dig a little bit further within the scenarios that you, and of course the conversations that you organized. What was kind of coming up, like, with how does your DAO distribute artistic power? Like, how was that kind of shaped or conversed? Or could you just kind of, I'm always just very interested about, like, because of course, in a sense, they're quite, they don't exactly gel together, right? The DAO and the artistic power. So I'm just wondering if you can unpack that a bit.
I think the DAO would allow for a bit more agency for artists to kind of have, to create different kind of practice. I think it's a question of creating a space for artists to be able to make decisions within the studio itself. Yeah, I'm not sure if I...
Yeah, I think something else that came up, and this came up more in workshop 1, where we were looking at the contemporary art scene and practice and the way it exists at the moment. And what was coming up was that there were these networks, there were gatekeepers, and there were sort of silos of practice. And I think the vision for something like Covalence would be that would be transparent or exposed in a way that enables you, no matter your sort of career path, your career trajectory, the resource that you need, or the value of what you are doing, to access various people sort of in a equal way.
Could you potentially speak me through like a hypothetical way in which that would like work from the studio to like a final proposition from convalescent? Like a totally hypothetical situation.
In terms of the distribution of power,
yeah, like how does it, like how would, like what would be like the first step, the second step, the third step, like dream scenario, not even hypothetical.
This will be a little bit impromptu, so we might get tongue-tied. But so a hypothetical scenario would be if we're both on this in the studio system and on the network, right. And I want to make a sound work, but I have no sound skills, and then I would broadcast a message or to the broader community, or I would specifically go to Bhavisha and say, I need these sound skills for this project. She could either accept my sort of submission or pass it on to someone else or decline it. If she accepts it, then we could work collaboratively on the project and agree on that, the scope of the collaboration. And then the vision is to ultimately have that either be some sort of shared ownership within that.
Yeah. So one of the possibilities that we've been thinking about is fractal ownership for collaborative projects. How could that possibly work? Don't have the answers yet, but it's something that could be quite dope.
Valuable. Yeah.
Could be dope to try to figure out a system in which, I mean, again, with collaborative projects, there's always different dynamics within the collaboration itself. So how would one even come to kind of, I don't know,
Consensus.
Consensus in terms of the value of that splitting of ownership necessarily.
And then one of the sort of additional features that we were playing around with the participants in workshop 2 was whether we would be able to review each other's contribution to that project or our exchange. There were many people who didn't like the idea of that happening. And there were a couple of people who were like, there's value in making that exchange, the success of the exchange transparent in terms of developing trust within the network. And I think that's what sort of happens in real life. You know, if I'd say to Bhavisha, she'd go check, oh, is Kylie cool? Like, does she work well?
Competent.
Go and get reviews from other people. What's her work like? All of those sorts of things. You know, the general sort of,
So kind of an integrity token would be offered. But then that also has the potential to warp. I mean, there was a lot of hesitancy towards this kind of rating system, but we threw it out there just to see, where it would land.
Yeah, we spoke about like having different, like a metric, like a scale, like a good, bad, not great, or just like a general review, like you would do on Airbnb in a way. So I mean, there's those sorts. That review system is quite complex, and I think that's something
have decided probably not to go with.
I mean, but the other thing is once Covalence comes to fruition, that sort of those features and those functionality should be determined by the participants. So in some way, like even if we have objections to that, if the system decides that that's what it needs, then I don't know.
It's like the system
is
super
like
automated thing.
I'm just there's some questions coming in from the audience, and I feel like you've probably addressed Maria's question. So Maria asked if you could elaborate on the notion of token and its application, and I think you're starting to show all the ways in which this is complicated, but some of the new ways of thinking that it's kind of elicited from you. I'd like to come to Stuart's question because it's something we're really fascinated by, which is, so Stuart said, what's the interface between the studio and the real world look like? How are you paying for things like rent? And this kind of connects with, I think, two things. So it connects with what you said, Bhavisha, about a space like Covalent Studios as a space for growing a community that doesn't exist yet, which is, I think, really a kind of interesting thing to think about. But also our interest really in how your DAO might change your locality, like what new physical spaces does it produce, generate, or service? So like really concretely, how might things look differently on the ground? If your DAO is working like in some of the ways that you have imagined might be interesting.
I mean, in the main, it's been conceptualized on it as a more of an online digital space. So there have also been conversations about using existing physical studio spaces as a kind of, how do I phrase this? So members within the digital studio who are affiliated to physically existing spaces, we would be able to like link up with those in kind of ad hoc ways.
like a satellite sort of situation. Yeah.
So, I mean, currently it's not envisioned as a physical space itself. I mean, that would be great. But of course, things like rent and who's going to be paying for things is something that would need to be resolved. And also, I mean, like rent in terms of a domain, you know, all of these kind of other costs that will be required for the running and maintenance is something that we're trying to figure out. And the labor, like who will be responsible fundamentally for the maintenance, even if it's automated. That makes sense.
Maybe that also just like segues into Martin Zinneger's question, which is that I'm also curious about how the ideals and the imagined structure of the organization manifest technologically. Is this the next step in your process, and will members / collaborators again be involved in designing this?
Good question, because right now it feels as though there's all these ideals would be like a utopian space that we're like trying to create, which fundamentally it feels as though it is that. And like how to bridge it with the actual, let's say, blockchain tech. I mean, we've been looking at things like Aragon or, I've been kind of doing some research into that. But I think currently we've been trying to do it on a more like lo-fi, kind of get 80% of the flows and architecture down, and then try find a suitable platform in which that could, let's say, process these different needs. And so I think once we have that, we've made decisions around that, we'll try find a kind of relevant technological platform.
Yeah, we've also been looking at like low tech solutions, like just something like Google Forms or Discord or Slack, in order to sort of simulate communication or exchanges, and to see like if the flows that we're coming up with, once transferred into like a digital space, would actually make that work well for members and collaborators. But ultimately, yes, members and collaborators would be involved in sort of reviewing those systems, participating in the design of that and how it would operate, because it's literally for them. So getting their buy-in is important.
So we're seeing real commonality, like a real commonality between your work and what Black Swan DAO are doing, which is this understanding that we use the tech that we can use right now to start to work through the patterns that DAOs will enable us to do. So we're kind of bootstrapping other techs to enable us to test the new kinds of behaviors and relationships. I think this is what we're seeing happening, which I think is really interesting. Now we have to wrap up, which is a shame. And I'd like to end just by reading some of the questions we haven't answered, so we can leave them floating in the minds of ourselves and the audience. So Maria asked a second question: how would the fractal ownership overcome IP? Inter asks, I'm curious how the members are involved in the making of the particular logics of the system. How do you deal with different levels of tech literacy? Maybe we've answered that a little bit. Nicholas says, are you concerned with the environmental costs of blockchain implementation? In one of these sessions, we are definitely going to make space for this conversation, possibly in the conversation that Penny and I have to end the sessions, because it's a big question that kind of overarches all of these prototypes, I think. And then Stephanie asks, how do you steward the mutual outputs and nurture your collective practices? Okay, so these are things that we are now just going to leave floating. We will absorb them, we will process them, and something will happen. Go.
And also, just to close the session, I would love it if you could just give me like a one-sentence answer. What I am really interested to know is, from all of your research and movement and bringing people together and speaking both digitally, physically, brewing this thing, learning a lot about these new technologies, which I know for some of your group, it wasn't as if you were a native in blockchain development, which I think is also extremely important for the listeners to know. What has decentralized autonomous organization, the concept of it, prompted you to do from now on in?
In our own practices or in...
Yeah, maybe from a personal position.
I think it's made me want to reach out a bit more within the kind of, because I also, I work rather independently. And so I think it's an opportunity to think about working a bit more collaboratively for myself with practitioners in Johannesburg. But also it kind of gives a way to like really think about a future. And I think about like the younger generation coming up, you know, like let's say blockchain tech like takes off in the next 5 years, like thinking about the younger graduates and what kind of space the studio could facilitate in terms of producing a different kind of level of work, basically. So I think it's an opportunity to think like in future kind of oriented ways. So that would be my answer.
Okay, now I'm going to be the one at the door saying, everybody out the door now. Sorry, we are going to be thrown out of this space. The meeting ends in 5 minutes. So I want us to have a nice relaxed kind of goodbye, and also just room for thanks. So massive thanks to Bhavisha and Carly tomorrow. An invitation for everyone to come next week, same time, same place, can we call this place, to meet the Zina and Nikolai Eve from Minsk to hear about Chimera DAO, and to thank the amazing Goethe Institute team for their work on this. There's a lot of work putting these things together, and they've made it feel very comfortable. Thank you so much. Penny, do you have any last words for us?
My only words would be, if you still have burning questions, please do put them into the Q&A, because I think that it's very much also not only about answering questions, but also about giving them time and space to breathe. And I think that if we are going to create any type of system, we need as much output and interest, and in a sense, it's about moving this Rubik's Cube around. And as I think Covalent Studios definitely showed us, sometimes it's about moving it in unconventional, sometimes the wrong ways, in order to get to also manifest the things that we really do care about and the things that we really do want to bring into our communities. So please also, we still want to hear your voices, even if we are not going to be in this room any longer. And it will add to the ongoing, never-ending communities and structures that we hopefully are committing to with this series.
And I think just worth saying that we are collating all the questions from attendees of these events, and we'll be publishing them all in one place so that everyone can come and have a look at what people have been thinking about and what the floating questions are. But I think that's it for this morning. Thank you. It's been amazing to see such a bunch of new names to me, and friendly names also in the attendees list. Thank you so much for coming. We realise 9 o'clock, at least in the UK, is a bit early, and we really appreciate your presence. Thank you so much.